Reverend Yates had awaited his coming, first for hours, then days and weeks. Now it was December, and as cold as any in memory. When he'd lowered the metal well bucket, it clanged as if hitting iron. It took a leashed pitchfork, cast like a harpoon, to finally break the ice. He was bringing the water back to the manse when Jason Gunter came out of the woods on horseback. Reverend Yates took the water inside and returned with a shotgun that, until this moment, had never been aimed at anything other than a squirrel or rabbit. Gunter saw the weapon, but did not turn the horse. Even in the saddle, the younger man swaggered, the reins loosely held, body rocking side to side. Not yet 30, but already responsible for one wife's death, nearly a second. "That's a mighty unneighborly way to be greeted," Gunter said, smiling as he dismounted, "especially by a man of the cloth." "I figured it would be one you understood," Reverend Yates replied. Gunter opened his frock coat to show the absence of knife or pistol. "I didn't come for a tussle, preacher." Gunter was dressed in much the same attire he'd arrived in 4 years ago, leather boots and wool breeches, white linen shirt and frogged gray coat. And then his black hair was slicked back and glistening with oil, his fingernails trimmed, undarkened by dirt. A dandy, people had assumed, which caused many to expect Gunter to fail miserably when he'd bought the farm adjoining Elizabeth Vaughan's property, but that hadn't been the case at all. He had brought his wife with him, a woman clearly once attractive, but now hunch-shouldered. Her eyes were striking, the color of wisteria, though she seldom raised them when in town. A month after they'd come, she'd hanged herself from a crossbeam in the barn, or so the sheriff concluded. Reverend Yates lowered the shotgun so it rested in the crook of his arm, but the barrel still pointed in Gunter's direction. "If it's about where Susanna is—" "It ain't about knowing where she is," Gunter answered. "That's over and done with." "What is it, then?" "I got need to be baptized." When Reverend Yates didn't respond, the younger man quit smiling. For a few moments they stared at each other. "If you want someone to baptize you," Reverend Yates said, "there are plenty of other preachers who can do it." "Who said I wanted it?" Gunter turned and placed 2 fingers in his mouth and gave a sharp whistle. Eliza Vaughan and her 14-year-old daughter Pearl came out of the woods and stood silently by the horse's haunches. Reverend Yates stared at her questioningly, but she would not meet his gaze. Beneath a coat once worn by her husband, the woman shivered, and perhaps not just from the cold. He had warned her not to let Susanna marry Gunter, but despite what had happened to Gunter's first wife, Eliza did not stop the marriage. Widowed, she'd been forced to raise her daughters on her own. Gunter was a broad-shouldered man, strong enough to keep the farm running. The first wife's death hadn't been Gunter's doing, Eliza claimed. "He ain't never drank a drop of liquor," she'd say, as if all the men needed alcohol to summon their perfidy. After the marriage, Gunter helped support Eliza and Pearl, keeping them in firewood, helping plant and harvest crops, digging a new well. But there had been a price. First, a pump knot swelling Susanna's left brow. Then, 2 weeks later, an arm so wrenched out of the socket that it hung useless at her side for weeks. Susanna did not claim she'd bumped her head entering a root cellar or twisted her arm restraining a rambunctious cow. She offered no explanation, nor did her mother or sister, even after several women in the congregation, out of curiosity or compassion, inquired. Her lot in life was to suffer, Susanna appeared to believe, but on that Sunday, watching her winch each time the arm moved, Reverend Yates told her it was not her duty to suffer. Even then, Susanna had said nothing. She turned and walked back through town, past the manse and up the wooded path to where Gunter waited. "Is this about your daughter, Eliza?" Reverend Yates added sharply. "Because if it is, I swore I'd never tell where she went, and I'll honor that, even with her own mother." It ain't about that hussy that you helped run off from me, Gunter said, looking at Eliza. You tell him. You're the one says I gotta do it. I want you to baptize Mr. Gunter, Eliza said. Why would you want that, Eliza? Reverend Yates said. To marry Pearl, the widow answered softly. She's of a mind it'll wash my devilment right out of me, Gunter said. I don't think much is in me, but it seems some folks do. Anyway, if getting doused puts a mother's mind at ease, I'll abide it. Pearl is a child, Reverend Yates said. He looked at the girl, wrapped in a quilt she cinched tight around her neck. Like her mother, she stared at the ground. There's many been married at her age, preacher, Gunter said. There is one in your own congregation. Reverend Yates looked at Pearl. She was not shivering, but her cheeks glowed from the cold. He had baptized her and Susanna on that same July Sunday 5 years ago. A thin, delicate child, one often sick. He remembered how light she'd felt as he took her in his arms and lowered her into the water. You and your mother come into the house, child. Nah, Gunter said. We need to be getting back. Some of us has to work more than just on Sundays. Eliza, Reverend Yates said. She looked at him now, her pale face blank. This Sunday, preacher, Gunter said, douse me in the morning, and me and Pearl will get the justice of the peace to marry us right after. I done got that set up. Our baptisms are held in warmer weather. I know for a fact you baptized Henry Cope last winter, Gunter challenged. He was dying, Reverend Yates answered. Even then it wasn't this cold. I know that water will be cold, Gunter said, grinning now, but I figure Pearl will warm me up real good later. It isn't just the water that cleanses a man, Reverend Yates answered. It's what is in his heart. I know that, preacher. What if I won't do it? We'll go to Boone. There's more than one preacher in this county. Of course, that's a mighty long walk for Eliza and Pearl, especially with the chance of more snow coming. Gunter turned and nodded at Eliza and Pearl. Go on now, he said. Reverend Yates watched mother and child walk out of the yard and into the woods, stepping into their early footprints, as if in Gunter's presence they dare not even disturb the snow. We'll be seeing you Sunday, preacher, Gunter said, raising finger and thumb to tip his hat. He nodded at the shotgun. I'm a forgiving man. Maybe you ought to be the same, especially since I wouldn't be needing a wife if you'd not meddled in another man's business. I know my business, Gunter, Reverend Yates replied, but the words sounded feeble. Good. Do it come Sunday. Gunter jerked the reins and the horse turned. He kicked a boot heel against its flank and went back up the path. Even when Gunter was out of sight, Reverend Yates heard the crunching of snow under the horse's hooves. He stared at the woods, the bare gray branches reaching upward like wailing women. Susanna had come in the middle of the night, knocking frantically on the front door. Looking out the manse's window, he'd seen her silhouetted behind a lantern's glow. When Reverend Yates ushered her in, he saw she was barefoot and dressed only in a shift. Susanna raised the lantern to show the red and purple marks where his fingers had grasped. All I done was be late fixin' his bath, Susanna pleaded, terror in her eyes. He said next time it'd be a rope around my neck, not a hand. He'd do it, Reverend. You know he would. What would you have me do? Get me away from here, someplace he'll never find me. What of your mother and sister? The fear in Susanna's eyes dimmed. They ain't able to stop him from killing me, she answered, a sudden coldness in her voice. Whether she had or had not understood the intent of his question, Reverend Yates would never know. She asked for his help, he told himself, so how could he not give it? Was there a relative Who could take her in, he asked. One not close by, but that she could get to by train. Susanna nodded. He'd put a quilt around her, and they walked down the street to Marvin Birch's house. The three of them had gone to Birch's Dry Goods to purchase Susanna shoes, clothes, and undergarments, enough to wear and also fill a carpet bag. Marvin was known as a skinflint, but he refused any money, which was all to the good because it left $20 to give her after Reverend Yates paid for the ticket to Johnson City. She could get to her final destination from there, he told her. Afterward, he'd returned to the manse and waited for Gunter to show up, the shotgun by the door, unloaded, but Gunter would not know that. But it was Eliza who'd come on that October morning. Reverend Yates told her he didn't know where Susanna was and would swear so on a Bible if need be. Without another word, Eliza walked back up the path to her farm. Except for some glares when they'd passed each other in the street, Gunter did nothing. Perhaps he believed, as Reverend Yates feared, Susanna would return on her own. He'd seen it before, women or children fleeing and then returning, not out of corporal need, but some darker necessity. At such times, he feared some malevolent counterpart to grace operated in the world. But Susanna had not returned. Gunter obtained a divorce on the grounds of abandonment. A polite knock interrupted Reverend Yates' reverie. Opening the door, he found 4 congregation members on the porch. In the forefront, Marvin Birch. He invited them in. Birch seemed reluctant, but the others eagerly left cold, though no one sat when offered a chair. "We have heard about Gunter's latest outrage," Birch said. "If I had known this was the purpose of his divorce, I would have ensured Judge Lingard did not grant it. What Gunter proposes, surely you will not allow." "If you mean the marriage itself, I have no part in it," he says. He says he will go to the justice of the peace. "But the baptism," Birch said, "what of it?" "If I don't, Gunter told me he'll go elsewhere," Reverend Yates answered. "But if you do," Birch sputtered, "it would mean the community condones this abomination." "It was Eliza, a member of our congregation, not Gunter, who asked me this of me." "That is of no importance, Reverend," the storekeeper bristled. "Let him go elsewhere." "He will make them walk there, Marvin, and in this weather such a trek could give a girl with her delicate constitution the whooping cough or an influenza. Do you want that on your conscience?" "Doubtful, I say," Birch answered. "But if so, might not death be better for the child than being wedded to that blackguard?" "There is something else," Reverend Yates said, his voice more reflective. "What if the act itself, despite Gunter's lack of sincerity, were to truly cleanse the man?" For a few moments the only sound was the crackle and hiss of the hearth's burning wood. "You believe Gunter capable of change?" "No," Reverend Yates answered, "but God is capable. It is the mystery of grace. I cannot be true to my responsibilities if I doubt the possibility." "But our responsibility as town elders is different, Reverend. We cannot permit this." "So you question God's wisdom in worldly matters?" "God allows us the ability to discern evil, Reverend, and the strength to defy it." "Yet not in this matter," Reverend Yates replied, with less certainty than he wished he'd had. "But assured, I have not made my decision lightly, gentlemen. I appreciate and understand your concern, but the baptism must be allowed." The next morning at the service, Gunter sat with Eliza and Pearl on the back pew. Reverend Yates had contemplating altering the sermon he'd written out on Thursday night, but found himself too vexed to do so. As planned, he spoke of Moses and how he'd led his people to the promised land, though unable to enter the place himself. He read the sermon with as little attentiveness as his congregation offered in their listening, Gunter's presence casting a pall over the whole church. Reverend Yates did not announce the baptism. Instead, he waited until the church emptied, but for Gunter, Eliza, Pearl, and himself. "This weather, surely." "We got quilts and dry clothes, and even a sheet if you ain't got me a gown," Gunter said. "I'm going to have a fire on the bank, too. Got my wood and kindlin' and flint rock all ready waitin'. So we'll go on out there, preacher. Have a fire going so you don't catch cold." Reverend Yates went to the manse and changed into the cotton trousers and white linen shirt he always wore for baptisms. He put on a wool scarf and his heaviest overcoat. The water might rise up to his hips, but the pants would dry quickly by the fire. So he took no change of clothes, only a drying cloth. The baptism pool was a quarter-mile away. Reverend Yates saddled his horse and followed Eliza's and Pearl's footprints in the snow, unsurprised when the hoofprints of Gunter's mount, which preceded the women and child, merged with those of other horses. The trail curved, and the river lay before him. A man-high fire blazed at the forest's edge, stoked with enough wood to burn for hours. Pearl and Eliza huddled beside it, Gunter close by. Reverend Yates dismounted and tethered his horse to a dogwood branch sleeved with ice. The elders stood on the river bank. In the crook of Marvin Birch's right arm was a rifle. As Reverend Yates approached, Birch stepped aside so he could see the river. "Tell me that ain't a sign from God, Reverend," the store owner said, facing the river as well. The river's deep bend that served as the baptism pool was completely iced over, the snow-limbed surface unmarked but for the tracks of a single raccoon. Had Reverend Yates not known otherwise, he would have thought a meadow or a pasture lay before him. "When have you ever seen it covered like this?" Birch asked, his thumb on the rifle's trigger guard. "Never a one of us has. It's a sign to us all, and I'll abide no man to profane it." Reverend Yates turned and looked at Gunter, who appeared in deep reflection as he, too, stared at the frozen river. "Martin's right," another elder said. "It's surely a sign from God, Reverend." The other elders nodded their assent. For a few moments, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. "There will be no baptism today," Reverend Yates finally said. Only then did Gunter rouse himself. He shook his shoulders as if to cast off some burden. "It's just ice," he said, and he walked to the river's edge. He placed a foot on the ice, pressed his boot heel more firmly until his full weight was upon it. "Fetch me a stout limb, woman," Gunter said to Eliza. As Eliza turned from the fire, Marvin Birch stepped close to Gunter. He gripped the rifle on the upper stock and held it out. "God won't let you break that ice, even with this, Gunter," the store owner announced, nodding at the butt end. "And it's made of hickory." "We'll see about that, damn you," the younger man replied, grabbing the rifle barrel with both hands and thrusting the butt downward. The sharp report of shattered ice was instantly followed by a louder crack. The sounds crossed the river, echoed back. Gunter still gripped the iron barrel. He appeared to stare down at it intently as skeins of gray smoke encircled his head. He gave a violent shudder and fell forward. The webbed ice opening to accept the body. Gunter slowly sank. Soon the only sign of him was the water's pinkish tinge. In the months following Gunter's death, the community made certain that Eliza and Pearl were cared for. Spring crops were planted and harvested, wood for winter sent by. At 16, Pearl married Lewis Hampton, whose father owned the valley's best bottomland, ensuring Eliza, as well as her daughter, would never again go wanting. Susanna's learned of Gunter's death through the relatives and returned for Pearl's wedding, though she did not stay, having made a life elsewhere. But Susanna and her family visited yearly, even after Eliza died. On such Sundays, the sister and their husbands and children filled a pew. To look upon such a sight from his pulpit was surely a sign of God's grace. Reverend Yates told himself, but on late nights he sometimes contemplated his silence when Marvin Birch offered the cocked weapon. Had his refusal to warn Gunter been a furtherance of God's will, or his own desire to be rid of the man? On such nights, the parlor became nothing more than shadows and silence. The manse's stillness widened beyond the walls and into the vastness of the whole valley.